This episode of Order from Ashes is part of Shia Power Comes of Age, the transformation of Islamist politics in Iraq. In the first episode in this short mini-series, I spoke with Sajad Jiyad about the nature of that radical transformation of Shia Islamist politics after the U.S. invasion in 2003 and what the significance of that transformation has been for politics in Iraq and more widely. In the second episode, I spoke with Marsin Alshammary about the question of whether clerics have seen their authority diminish as they've been able to play a more direct and influential role in politics. In the third episode, I spoke with Taif Alkhudary about protest politics in Iraq and the challenge that they have mounted to sectarian, sect-based political movements. Today, in the fourth and final episode in this mini-series of Shia Power Comes of Age, I'm speaking with Al-Mawlawi about the uncomfortable coexistence of sectarianism and prejudice with the ascent of Shia Islamist factions to the central role of power in Iraq. I'm Thanassis Cambanis. Welcome to Order from Ashes, Century International's podcast. Today, I'm talking with Ali Al-Mawlawi as part of our Shia Politics series. He wrote a report called Iraqi Shia Factions Are Supposedly Anti-State, but State Power is What They Want. Ali, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
So you wrote this report that is in some ways about a common slur levied against Shia Islamist factions in Iraq and your argument about how we should think about this differently. Start us off by telling us what is this label anti-state and how is it deployed and weaponized in Iraqi politics?
Sure. So, I mean, in Arabic, the term that is used is la dawla, which can be translated as anti-state. Another way of translating it is sort of in common Western academia, you would call it a failed state. So it really refers to the absence of a state, the absence of a functioning state. And the term kind of took on, it basically became quite common in terms of its usage during the 2019 Tishreen protests. And then it actually developed into a way to describe actors who are perpetuating a failed state. And they call them al-quwa la dawla, the forces of the anti-state.
So this label is relatively new in post 2003 Iraqi politics. This isn't a label that was used in previous power struggles between Shia factions.
Not really, no. I mean, there were some references to the anti-state prior to 2019, but it really became quite popularized once the Tishreen protests kicked off.
So, and this is like complementary to, but a little different from the affirmative cry of the protests, which was Nurid al-Watan, we want a state. So this is like the flip side of it, which is to describe these sort of mainstream status quo actors as being, forces for a vacuum, forces that are trying to undermine state authority.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the criticism that was levied by the protesters was that, the ruling elite, and specifically, I would argue the Shia elite, the Shia Islamist elite, were undermining the state, that they were, somehow not committed to the state, not committed to, the preservation of the state. And that's really, I think, the thinking behind using that label against, the political elite.
So as we go forward, we're gonna get into some of your really interesting analysis on why this matters and how we should think about it differently. But first, I want to really locate this discourse in recent Iraqi history, because I think part of why this is important is because there has been a long-running current of essentializing Shia Iraqis as somehow being fifth columnists or not truly patriotic or not really Iraqi. So talk to us a little bit about how far back this goes and this sort of idea, which I think became common at least as far back as the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s during which Saddam's government often tried to paint Shia Iraqis as somehow Iranian or foreign or not loyal.
Yeah, so these sort of anti-Shia tropes have been around all the way back since the founding of modern Iraq, and there are numerous references to suggestions that the Shia of Iraq are not they're not even Arab, they're Persians, their loyalties lie outside of Iraq, they're not committed to the country. And you see this going as far back as the monarchy period, but it really kind of was heightened during the Ba'ath period, and it really culminated in what happened with the deportation of Shia Iraqis to Iran. They were labeled as Taba'iyya, people that have Persian roots, that were considered not even Iraqi, even though they were born in Iraq, their parents were born in Iraq, lived in Iraq their whole lives. And they were basically, deported to Iran with the suggestion that, their loyalties are actually with Iran. They're not even Iraqis. And these sort of tropes, these accusations, they've always really existed. And my concern is that, we need to really learn from history. We need to be very weary of anti-Shia tropes, even, in the post-2003 period.
So in the recent incarnation, so we're talking about the sort of post-2019 series of crises. One government was overthrown. One government had to resign because of the protests. The next government was fairly hobbled, and this latest government was formed in the wake of yet another series of protests. In this whole period, there's been a lot of concern about fragmentation of state power, about whether the state is capable of controlling Iraq, and whether Iraq's weakness is the result of some kind of foreign conspiracy, right? So how does all this feed into a political discourse in which La Dawla, the anti-state, becomes a problematic label in your view for talking about these dominant Shia Islamist factions?
So one of the key areas of discourse in the post-2003 period is the role of external actors, and one of them are the neighboring countries, be that Iran or the Gulf or others. And so, that there has been a lot of attention focused on, Iran's role in Iraq, its influence over the country. And so I would say that the La Dawla term became very much associated with Shia Islamist groups that are considered to be closely aligned to Iran. And my sort of issue with this approach is, number one, what it does is it suggests that these groups are not loyal to Iraq, that they're subordinate to an external power. And I think that the real picture is much more complicated, and it really has to do with, issues to do with identity, the fact that, individuals and groups can have multiple layers of identities. But essentially, I think what the point that I was really making was that all of these groups, whether you agree with them or not, whether you take major issues with their political ideologies, with their role in politics, with their post-2003 role in power sharing and in running the state, at the end of the day, they're all Iraqis. They're not Iranians. They may see themselves as strategically aligned to Iran, but that's very different to calling them Iranians. And I think that for me, my issue is that if you want to have a constructive discourse about the role of Shia Islamists in Iraq, then it needs to be done in a much more, shall we say, constructive way, and using these sort of labels, Quwa La Dawla, forces of the anti-state. It doesn't really raise the level of debate. All it does is it kind of puts people against each other. It creates divisions between people within society, and it doesn't really lead to anything. And at the end of the day, these groups aren't going anywhere. They're Iraqis. They have their deep roots within Iraqi society, and I think we just need to have a much better quality of debate over the role of these groups in Iraq.
Well, so one question I have is, who really is using this kind of concept? I mean, is it other establishment Shia Islamist parties that have their own militias that are using it against their own rivals? Is it fringe groups that have little power but have some kind of intellectual capital? So in other words, where does this discourse, where do these labels live in Iraqi political discourse and culture these days?
I mean, they live everywhere, really. And in terms of the Tishreen protests, a lot of the protesters were using those labels against these groups. But then, even during the 2021 elections, during the campaign, there were Shia, groups, parties that were also using these labels against their rivals, and so it's almost become normalized to use this term. I don't want to put too much emphasis on the term in the sense that you don't hear it all the time. It's not that you're constantly being bombarded with this term, but for me, it's an illustration of the nature of the discourse in Iraq, which really needs to be corrected.
Yeah, I mean, the counter argument here is that this discourse is not the problem. The problem is the terrible behavior and the bad actions of these armed groups that are, mafia cartels with their own militaries that sort of operate under the banner of supposedly being Shia Islamist factions, but in reality they are violent interest groups that aren't really concerned with representing anybody, whether they're supposed Shia Islamist constituents or any other swath of the Iraqi public. So I do wonder, is the problem the discourse, or is the problem the abuse of the abuse in practice by all these factions? And when I look at your sort of analysis of the space, one of the things I'm struck by is that really this label either has been or can be applied to literally every single one of the major status quo factions, right? So not just the ones that are perceived as being close to Iran, but literally all of the powerful Shia Islamist factions, could quite, I think, plausibly be described as acting to undermine the operation and function of state institutions, not as foreign agents, but simply as self-interested agents.
Absolutely, I think that's a completely reasonable point to make, and I do say in the paper that I think that if the term was used to identify practices that were undermining the state, then sure, I wouldn't have a problem with the use of this term. But the problem with it is that it's used exclusively against Shia Islamist groups, and what that does is that kind of labels not just Shia Islamists, but in my view, I think Shias more broadly, with this label of not being committed to the state, having their loyalties lie outside. And I always think back to history and these tropes that we initially talked about. The danger is with this discourse is that it perpetuates these tropes, these anti-Shia tropes, and then you have Shias who are not even Islamists, who are maybe just religious but aren't even politically active, who also get labeled and tarnished with these terms. But I completely take the point. I mean, I think it's perfectly legitimate to take a look at these groups and break down exactly what is it that they're doing, what kind of behaviors are they engaging in that are completely self-interested, that have nothing to do with preserving Iraq's interests, that are actually damaging Iraq's reputation, both domestically and abroad. And this is a perfectly reasonable discourse to have.
I think that's a really important point, and I guess I'd underscore. Historically, there's a lot of sectarianism in the region and in Iraq that sort of masquerades as not being sectarian, right? So pre-2003, there was a veneer that the regime was somehow not a sectarian regime, even though it was a not just a Sunni regime, a Sunni inflected regime, but one that was oriented around one particular clan and family. But anyway, we don't need to get lost in the weeds. But it's certainly my contention that a lot of sectarianism, in particular anti-Shia sectarianism by Sunnis, has been carefully phrased so that, in a sort of legalistic sense, its practitioners can claim that they're not being sectarian, right? That they're being nationalist, that they're being secular, and they're being somehow unfairly painted as sectarian. So I see this phenomenon you're talking about, and I think it's hard to parse out, but I see it as being part of that tradition because, in theory, criticizing militia factions for being anti-state is completely unremarkable in a context where the state is in shambles. But in actual practice, if that term and that language is only being deployed against Shia Islamists, where we can see every other political grouping doing the same thing, Kurds, Sunnis, others, and they're not being described that way, then it becomes yet another iteration of this kind of subtly mobilized sectarianism, where those who are attuned to it know exactly what's intended, but in a court of law or in a debating society, the people who are lobbying this kind of language around could claim dishonestly that they didn't have any sectarian intent. Is that a fair sort of take on what's going on here?
Absolutely. I mean, this is exactly what I'm trying to get at. I mean, bigotry often comes in very subtle forms, whether that's, anti-Semitism or racism or, sectarianism. It's often manifested in very subtle forms, in the form of dog whistles. And this really is essentially what I'm concerned about, is that the language that is used in discourse to critique Shia Islamists is highly problematic. And the La Dawla term is just one of many that I would suggest is problematic.
All right, we'll be right back after a short break. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, and I'm speaking with Al-Mawlawi. You're listening to the Order from Ashes podcast from Century International. And you can find Ali's report as part of our Shia Politics project on the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org. And the report is titled Iraqi Shia Factions Are Supposedly Anti-State, but State Power is What They Want. We'll be right back.
Today's world is changing faster than ever. Old rules don't apply, and the new rules haven't been written. At least not yet. I'm Rohan Advani, and I produce the Order from Ashes podcast at the Century Foundation, a leading progressive think tank that promotes peace, cooperation, and equality at home and abroad. On Order from Ashes, we try to make sense of a new international system in which America no longer dictates the global order. Join us as we talk to activists and analysts on the front lines of the most pressing issues in international policy.
Welcome back. I'm Thanassis Cambanis. I'm speaking with Al-Mawlawi on the Order from Ashes podcast. We're talking about a sort of slur or characterization of being fifth columnist and anti-state, or La Dawla in Arabic is the term, that's been recently weaponized in Iraqi politics. And Al-Mawlawi has written a study of this as part of our Shia Politics project. Before the break, Ali, you were talking about sort of problematic bigotry and sectarianism in play, and I just wanted to follow up on that a little before we broaden out to your sort of view of the antagonistic visions of politics in Iraq. Tell me, because I think this is often overlooked, right? Because the Shia Islamist factions are dominant in Iraq. They control the government. They're the main holders of power. Tell us, in your view, how sort of despite nearly 20 years of power, this political space still contends with prejudice or sectarianism, despite its sort of arrival at the center of power.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I would say that, while Shia Islamists have dominated the political space, they haven't necessarily, entirely dominated it. I mean, yes, they're a demographic majority, the Shia. They've held, the highest positions in the state since 2003. But also, I mean, there are multiple other non-Shia factions that have also held positions of influence. And so, it's not, I don't like to use the term Shia rule, because Shia rule suggests that it's only Shias that are running the country, and that in Iraq is certainly not the case. And, you just have to look at the way that government is run, not just its composition, but the way that it functions. You can clearly see, I mean, it actually doesn't function very well, but, the way that the state is run, you can see that there is, this power sharing mechanism whereby, people from other ethnic and sectarian backgrounds are also involved in running the state. And so I think, there's lots of aspects of this to look at in terms of why sectarianism has persisted over the years. But what I would say is that I think that there is some sort of an equilibrium that exists between Iraq's various ethno-sectarian components at the heart of power. And that in many ways is why I think that it's not accurate to characterize Iraq as being ruled by the Shia.
What this suggests is that there is actually a sort of tension between Shia preeminence in this messy pluralistic system that's emerged in Iraq and a persistent sectarian bigotry and bias against all the major groups in Iraq and prominently today against the Shia, because they're the as the sort of main stakeholder of power. They're therefore going to be an important recipient of sectarian characterizations. And I do think it's important when we think and talk about this. I mean, we're part of a Shia politics working group that's focused on the evolution of Shia Islamist politics in Iraq, but these don't evolve in a vacuum. They're evolving in a context where all the nation's politics are rooted in ethno-sectarian identity groups, right? So Shia Islamist politics is playing out alongside Kurdish politics and Sunni Islamist politics. And to my knowledge, there's not any major trans identity group nationalist political bloc that has evolved alongside these other factions. So none of this is on its own, right? It's happening in dialectic with other quite extreme views, right? So Shia Islamist politics and this charge of being anti-state is coming about at a time when ISIS has just briefly taken over a third of the country with a call of genocide against Shia and has had just engaged in massacres, including Spiker. So there was the Kurdish independence referendum. So we're in a context where every major group is going to various lengths to both undermine state authority and define themselves in a sort of maximalist way by their ethno-sectarian identity group. And I think in that context, it becomes clearer why you see this as a problem, this kind of language, because even though the Shia are so maybe first among equals in terms of government power, they're still even as recently as 2017 or 2018 facing violence at the hands of Takfiri sectarians who believe that Shia Iraqis don't deserve to live.
And I would add to this that the putting to one side the competition between Shias and Sunnis and Kurds over power, the other thing that is really worrying is the growing polarization in society. And obviously this is something that you see with a lot of open societies around the world these days, this growing trend where the left and the right have stopped talking to each other. They're talking over each other. The extreme fringes on both ends are dominating the discourse. And I think this is the same in Iraq. There's this growing trend where, you have people on both ends of the spectrum that are using rhetoric that is extremely divisive, that is extremely toxic, and it doesn't help move the discourse in the right direction. And my concern, one of my main concerns in all of this, is about Iraq's stability. I mean, Iraq is still a fragile country. And, while it is a sign of a healthy society that you have, free and open debate, and that, if you turn on the TV in Iraq, you can find political views expressed in all different directions. But then when those views are dominated by the extremes on both sides, this is something that needs to be addressed. And, for all of your listeners in the US and predominantly in the West, these are problems that I think we're all facing. And how do you moderate these sort of discussions and let the moderates, have their say and try to bring these various factions together? And in Iraq, I would say, maybe the division is not between conservatives and liberals necessarily. Maybe it's not between the left and the right, but there's certainly one of the sort of divisions is between people who subscribe to sort of a more of a Islamist or religious worldview and those who subscribe to a secular worldview. And that is completely fine in a society like Iraq, where you have those different positions. But then, I think for me, it's about, well, how can we bridge the gap? We're never going to get everyone to agree, and that's fine. But, how can we get the discourse to a level where it's constructive rather than destabilizing for the country?
Which leads us, I think, to one of the interesting focuses of the last section of your report, where you move into an analysis of what is the actual struggle over. So explain, if you will. So you're saying that it isn't a question of being against the state or for the state. It's actually a struggle for control of the state and its power and resources. So tell us how you affirmatively characterize this discourse. And I think you cite the example of the Dawa Party as an illustration of a better way of understanding this tension over what these factions really are fighting over.
Yeah, so really, in my estimation, the struggle is not between those who believe in the state and those who don't. The struggle is over the identity of the state. And by that, I mean, you can break down state identity into many sort of constituent parts. But, one of them, for example, is the role of religion. I mean, it's a highly contentious issue. To what extent should religion play a role in politics, or should it be something that people practice in their homes or in their mosques or churches? That's a huge issue. Again, not exclusive to Iraq. The other issue is to do with regional alliances. I mean, should Iraq strategically align itself with the East, primarily Iran and, say, China, Russia, or is it better off aligning itself more closely with the West? That's another hugely contentious issue. The other one is to do with the way that state power is configured, and there are lots of aspects of this. I mean, one of the big debates in Iraq that is just sort of ongoing all the time is, is Iraq better off being a parliamentary system or a presidential system? How should the various security agencies operate? What kind of power should they have? There's a lot of contention, even within the Shia ruling elite, as to whether the parties that have militias or armed wings, whether they should be involved in politics, whether they have the right to hold positions, particularly security positions, because, for many, that seems like a way of undermining the state authority. So all of these things, I would say, come under this broad rubric of state identity. And for me, that is a much more constructive discussion to have between people from all walks of life. What exactly is your vision for Iraq? What is it that you want Iraq to look like in the future for your children and for your grandchildren?
Another element of this, which I wanted to see what you thought of, is in my estimation, every major faction in Iraq has worked to actively undermine central state authority, right? They're cannibalize, the Sadrists cannibalize state bureaucracies in order to enrich their coffers. Some of the smaller, militia-centered groups are eager to undermine state authority so that their weapons can't be controlled by a central authority. Some of the bigger Maliki famously, while he was in power, tried to create as much centralized authority under his own power as he could, and then once he was out of power, became another entropic player, helping keep the state fragmented. And this goes for the major Kurdish factions and the major Sunni players as well. There isn't any major player that I can think of who has actually engaged in a state building project, right? Whose platform has been make the state stronger and make its institutions more autonomous and more viable. So in that context, is there actually a sort of unanimity for a variety of different reasons in the major political factions being comfortable with a fragmented state, a state that has reduced capacity to govern, but also as a result, reduced susceptibility to be taken over by another dictator?
Yeah, so I would say there is an argument to be made about the fact that most of Iraq's political elite would like to see a state that is fairly fragile, because it allows them, as you say, to cannibalize the state and to benefit from its weakness. And numerous examples of this. I mean, we just have to talk about corruption. It's, the endemic corruption that exists in Iraq. That's a feature of the fact that the state is weak and that the ruling elite are able to to use that to benefit on a personal level. And I would add that that the problem that Iraq faces is often we talk about this post-2003 political settlement, which for me is a bit of an oxymoron in Iraq, because that never really was settled. Yes, there is to some extent a power sharing agreement between Shia, Sunnis, Kurds, and others, but the internal competition has persisted throughout the past 20 years, and it's never really settled, because all of Iraq's political elite generally think in very short-termist ways. It's all about survival. It's all about trying to undermine their rivals to get a bigger share of control of power. The power sharing has not settled in a way where people have just accepted that this is the way that the country is going to be for the foreseeable future. And so that rivalry, that competition, really continues to breed instability and fragility for the country. And that's why you just don't see, it's very rare to see politicians thinking in a very long-termist way, thinking beyond their personal interests, beyond their personal survival, and thinking more about, Iraq as a country and what its national interests should be going forward.
Yeah, and I think your analysis really helps deepen our understanding of one of the major obstacles to the emergence of a non-identity-based nationalism, right? And, I certainly think an important alternative to the fragmentation underway in Iraq would be the reemergence of, as there has been in the past, of belief systems or political allegiances that do not depend solely on one's sectarian or ethnic identity group. And I think it's a really toxic and pervasive part of the discourse that opponents of one group or another essentialize their rivals and say, in the case you're analyzing, they say these Shia Islamist factions are fifth columnists, not part of the state, creating a vacuum. We hear similar things said about Kurds by non-Kurds. We hear sometimes similar things said about Sunni Iraqis, and frankly, sometimes Sunni supporters of ISIS have said similar things themselves, right? So it's a really pervasive and problematic way of talking and thinking that makes it just makes it much harder to imagine the many millions of Iraqis who are interested in non-identity based ways of organizing their politics to find a way to actually translate that into meaningful coalitions on the ground.
Yeah, and it seems like an obvious thing to say, but people have different layers of identity as well. It's not either or. It's not that you're either nationalist or or you align with your sectarian component of your identity. That's just, it's natural for people to have different layers. And I think, as you say, if we stop essentializing people, then it allows us to understand what people's motivations are. And often people's motivations are multidimensional. And so we can go beyond the sort of the very basic rhetoric of, are you Iraqi first, or are you Shia first, or are you Sunni first, which is something that I sort of point out in the piece. You find polling conducted either by Iraqi civil society or even by DC-based think tanks who are going around asking people, are you Iraqi or are you Shia? I mean, it's kind of absurd to think in those terms. I mean, if I'm walking around in London and someone stops me and asks me, am I British or am I Muslim? I'd be outraged. And I think most people would be outraged by a question like that. And so it's really, again, it goes back to, this idea that let's just accept that everyone has, everyone believes in a state called Iraq. By and large, I mean, maybe the Kurds are a slight exception to the case, and that's fair enough in their case. Maybe they have aspirations for independence.
Well, they believe in a state called Iraq. They just might not want to be part of it.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's fair enough from my perspective. But what I'm saying is, if we're talking about, Shia Arabs, Sunni Arabs, let's move beyond this, suspicion that they're not interested in Iraq, they're interested in something else. And I would add just briefly that, a couple of weeks ago, Sayyid Ammar al-Hakim addressed the conference that he organized on sort of the future of Shia in Iraq. And I thought it was interesting what he said, because it's kind of relevant to what we're talking about. And what he tried to put forward was this idea of what he called al-Wataniya Shi'iyya, which kind of translates as Shia nationalism. And his sort of contention was that, yes, there is something called Shia identity, which goes beyond borders, right? And that is something that unites Shias on the basis of a theology, a way of, maybe not a way of life, but also, in terms of, their approach to practicing religion, in the same way that, Muslims are united in that way. But then he also added that actually Shias within their various constituent countries are different. They have their own priorities, their own interests at hand, whether they're Iraqis or Iranians or Bahrainis or living in the West. And so I think what he was trying to make the point is essentially that it's not either or. It's not that you have to choose between your Shia identity and your national identity. It's perfectly possible for the two to coexist.
Ali, thank you so much for your research and writing on the subject, and for your clear explanation of this important subject. You are listening to Order from Ashes, Century International's podcast. I've been speaking with Ali Al-Mawlawi. You can read his report that was part of our Shia Politics project that looks at the transformation of Shia Islamism in Iraq over the last 20 years. It's at the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org, and the report is called Iraqi Shia Factions Are Supposedly Anti-State, but State Power is What They Want. Ali, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
The Order from Ashes podcast has been brought to you by Century International. Our work builds on more than 100 years of commitment to international peace, security, and governance at the Century Foundation. We are independent, critical, and progressive. For more information about Century International's work, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We depend on audience feedback to reach new listeners. If you like what you hear, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.